Flight 891 from Seattle to Miami departed at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, climbing through scattered clouds into brilliant blue sky above the Pacific Northwest. The Boeing 757 carried 192 passengers across the country for the 6-hour journey. Aaron settled into his seat in 16B, preparing to work on an article during the flight. The passenger next to him, a woman absorbed in a novel, was quiet and unobtrusive. But 3 rows ahead in seat 13A, by the window, a man in his early 50s had begun whispering to himself the moment the plane started taxiing, and he hadn't stopped. For nearly 2 hours now, the man had been leaning close to the window, his lips moving constantly in rapid, urgent whispers, occasionally pressing his hand against the window glass, sometimes scribbling frantically in a small notebook. Flight attendant Rebecca Santos noticed the whispering passenger during her first walk through the cabin after reaching cruising altitude. She'd been flying for 12 years and had seen all kinds of unusual passenger behavior: nervous flyers who prayed constantly, people with OCD performing rituals, passengers with Tourette's syndrome exhibiting tics. She initially assumed the whispering man fell into one of those categories and made a mental note to check on him periodically. But as the flight continued and his whispering grew more agitated, more urgent, Rebecca's concern deepened. The man's behavior was escalating, not calming, and passengers around him were starting to notice and become uncomfortable. The man's name was Dr. Robert Hendricks, though Rebecca didn't know that yet. Robert was a structural engineer with 30 years of experience in aerospace design, specializing in aircraft stress analysis and material fatigue. He'd spent his career calculating load factors, analyzing metal fatigue, and ensuring aircraft structures could withstand the enormous forces of flight. But Robert had a secret that his colleagues didn't know about. He had high-functioning autism with an unusual form of synesthesia that allowed him to literally feel vibrations and structural stresses in a way neurotypical people couldn't. When Robert flew, he could sense things about the aircraft that instruments might not detect. Subtle vibrations, stress patterns, frequencies that indicated structural issues. It had made him extraordinary at his job. But right now, it was making him increasingly terrified. From the moment Flight 8091 had begun taxiing, Robert had felt something wrong. A vibration pattern that shouldn't be there. A frequency in the engine noise that concerned him. And now, 2 hours into the flight, that wrong feeling had intensified. Robert pressed his hand against the window, feeling vibrations traveling through the fuselage. His engineering mind was processing the frequency, amplitude, and pattern. His whispered calculations were attempts to quantify what his sensory perception was telling him. Harmonic resonance at 3.7 Hz, stress concentration, metal fatigue indicator, critical frequency approaching. He was speaking in technical jargon, trying to make sense of what he felt, trying to calculate whether his concern was valid or just anxiety. But wait, here's what made Robert's situation so difficult. He'd been told his entire life to ignore his feelings about aircraft stress because instruments were more reliable than human perception. Twice in his career, Robert had flagged aircraft for inspection based on his sensory perceptions, and both times, engineers had found nothing wrong with the instruments showing normal readings. Robert had been gently told he was being overcautious, that his anxiety was creating false positives, that he needed to trust the technology. So now, feeling something terribly wrong with Flight 8091, Robert was trapped between his screaming instincts and years of being told to ignore those instincts. He whispered his calculations, trying to convince himself either that the danger was real and he needed to alert someone, or that he was being paranoid again and should stay quiet. Rebecca approached Robert during her beverage service. "Sir, can I get you something to drink?" Robert barely looked at her, his attention focused on the window, his hand pressed against it, his lips still moving in constant whisper. I need to speak to the captain. It's urgent. The aircraft. Something's wrong with the aircraft." Rebecca's training immediately kicked in. When a passenger says something's wrong with the aircraft, you take it seriously, even if the person seems confused or anxious. "What do you mean, sir? What do you think is wrong?" Robert looked at Rebecca for the first time, and she was struck by the intelligence and fear in his eyes. This wasn't a confused person. This wasn't someone having a mental health episode. This was someone terrified by something he understood that others didn't. "I'm an aerospace structural engineer. 30 years analyzing aircraft stress. I can feel vibrations, frequencies that indicate structural problems. This aircraft has a harmonic resonance pattern consistent with metal fatigue and a critical structural component. It's getting worse. We need to land. Now. Please, I need to speak to the captain immediately." Rebecca's instinct was to dismiss this. Passengers constantly thought they understood aircraft better than pilots, constantly reported problems that were normal operation. But something in Robert's demeanor, his credentials, his specific technical language made her pause. "Stay here. I'm going to consult with the captain." She walked quickly to the cockpit, her mind racing. Was this a credible concern or anxiety? Should she interrupt the captain with what might be a passenger's paranoia? Captain Michael Torres listened as Rebecca explained the situation. 38 years of flying experience told him this was probably nothing. Aircraft were extensively monitored, instruments would detect any structural problems, and passengers' feelings were notoriously unreliable. But the fact that this passenger was an aerospace structural engineer specializing in stress analysis made Michael hesitate. "Bring him up here. Let me talk to him directly." Rebecca returned to Robert. "The captain will see you. Please come with me." Robert unbuckled with shaking hands and followed Rebecca to the cockpit. Captain Torres invited him in, and Robert immediately began explaining what he'd been sensing. "Captain, I know how this sounds. I know instruments don't show anything, but I have a sensory condition that allows me to feel structural vibrations that instruments might miss. What I'm feeling right now is a harmonic resonance at approximately 3.7 Hz that's building in intensity. That frequency is consistent with fatigue cracking in a critical airframe component, likely in the wing-to-fuselage attachment area. If that component fails at this altitude and speed, we'll experience catastrophic structural failure." Michael exchanged glances with his first officer, Sarah Kim. This sounded insane, a passenger claiming he could feel structural problems that sophisticated instruments didn't detect. But Robert's technical knowledge was evident, and his terror was genuine. "Dr. Hendricks," Michael said carefully, "all our instruments show normal. Vibration sensors, stress gauges, everything is in normal parameters. What you're feeling might be normal operational vibrations that you're interpreting as problems because you're anxious about flying." Robert shook his head adamantly. "I've flown hundreds of times. I know what normal feels like. This isn't normal." "Captain, I understand you have no reason to trust my perception over your instruments. But I'm begging you, please consider diverting to the nearest airport and having this aircraft inspected. If I'm wrong and I apologize for the inconvenience. But if I'm right and we keep flying, this aircraft will break apart. I can feel it building toward critical failure." You won't believe what Captain Torres did next. Every rational part of his brain said this was paranoia, that instruments were reliable, that diverting based on a passenger's feeling was absurd. But Michael had been flying long enough to know that sometimes the impossible happened, that instruments could miss things, that expertise came in unexpected forms. And something about Robert's certainty, his technical knowledge, his obvious terror made Michael consider the unthinkable. "Dr. Hendricks, if I divert this flight based on your concern, and we find nothing wrong, my career might be over. If I don't divert and you're right, everyone dies. Help me understand why I should believe you." Robert pulled out his notebook, filled with equations and stress calculations. "I've been calculating the stress loads based on the vibration frequency I'm sensing. If my perception is accurate, and I believe it is, the component experiencing fatigue is accumulating damage with every passing minute of flight. The harmonic resonance is literally shaking the weakened structure at its natural frequency, accelerating the crack propagation. We likely have less than 2 hours before catastrophic failure. Please, Captain, I know I sound insane, but my entire career has been built on understanding structural failure. I'm not wrong about this. I can't be." Michael made a decision that would either save 192 lives or end his career in humiliation. "Sarah, get me the nearest suitable airport and declare an emergency. Tell them we have a suspected structural issue and need to land immediately." Sarah's eyes widened, but she immediately complied. "Salt Lake City is closest, about 30 minutes out. Declaring emergency now." Michael turned back to Robert. "We're diverting. You better be right about this." The announcement to the cabin created immediate concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres. We're making an emergency landing in Salt Lake City due to a potential maintenance issue. This is purely precautionary. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing." Passengers erupted in anxious chatter. Emergency landing? Potential maintenance issue? What was happening? Aaron felt his stomach drop. Something must be genuinely wrong with the aircraft. Robert returned to his seat, still feeling the vibrations, still calculating in his whispered equations. Rebecca stayed near him, watching, silently praying he was right, because if he was wrong, the captain's career was finished and 192 passengers had been terrified unnecessarily. The flight descended rapidly towards Salt Lake City. Emergency vehicles mobilized at the airport. The cabin was tense, passengers gripping armrests, some crying, others praying. Michael flew with absolute focus, keeping the aircraft stable, reducing stress on the structure as much as possible based on Robert's warnings about harmonic resonance. 28 minutes after the diversion decision, Flight 8091 landed heavily but safely on Salt Lake City's runway. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft immediately. Passengers were evacuated via slides as a precaution. If there was a structural issue, the aircraft needed to be emptied quickly. Once everyone was off, maintenance engineers and FAA inspectors swarmed the aircraft for immediate examination. Michael, Sarah, Rebecca, and Robert stood on the tarmac waiting for the verdict. If nothing was wrong, Michael's decision to divert would be questioned extensively. Robert would be blamed for causing panic. But if something was found, the lead maintenance inspector emerged from the aircraft 90 minutes later, his face pale. He approached Captain Torres with a printout from ultrasonic inspection equipment. "Captain, you need to see this." The passenger who reported the structural concern was absolutely right. "We found a fatigue crack in the forward lower wing attachment fitting on the left side. The crack is 19 centimeters long and had propagated through 67% of the fitting's cross-section. Another 30 minutes of flight and it would likely have reached critical length. At altitude and speed, failure of that fitting would have caused catastrophic wing separation. Everyone aboard would have died." The inspector looked at Robert with something approaching awe. "How did you know? There were no instrument indications, no warning systems triggered. How did you sense something our monitoring systems didn't detect?" Robert's legs gave out and he sat down hard on the tarmac. He'd been right. His sensory perception had been accurate. The aircraft had been minutes from catastrophic failure. He'd saved everyone. But he'd also come within minutes of ignoring his instincts again, of staying quiet because people had told him not to trust his perceptions. "I felt it," Robert said simply. "The vibration frequency. The harmonic resonance. My autism gives me sensory perception that's different from neurotypical people. I can feel things others can't. And I felt that crack growing. I felt the structure screaming that it was about to fail." Captain Torres sat down beside Robert, his own hands shaking as the reality sank in. "You saved every life on this aircraft, including mine. If you hadn't insisted, if I hadn't listened, we'd have continued to Miami. That fitting would have failed over Nebraska or Iowa. We'd have broken apart at 37,000 feet. Nobody would have survived." Michael looked at Robert with profound gratitude and respect. "Thank you for trusting yourself enough to speak up, and thank you for not letting me dismiss you. You saved us all." The story exploded across media worldwide. The passenger who'd felt a structural crack that instruments missed. The captain who'd believed him and diverted despite having no instrumental evidence. The evacuation that prevented mass casualty. Boeing engineers descended on the aircraft, studying the failed fitting, trying to understand how it had cracked without triggering any monitoring systems. What they discovered was sobering. The crack had initiated in a location where no sensors were positioned, and the failure mode was unusual enough that vibration monitors hadn't flagged it as abnormal. Robert's unique sensory perception had detected something the aircraft's sophisticated monitoring systems had completely missed. Aran, who'd been on Flight 8091 and had evacuated down the emergency slide with everyone else, interviewed Robert extensively. "How did you know to trust your perception when you'd been told before that you were wrong?" Robert thought carefully before answering. "I almost didn't. I spent 2 hours trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling kept getting stronger, more urgent. Eventually I realized that being wrong and embarrassed was acceptable. Being right and silent was not. If I'd stayed quiet and everyone had died because I didn't want to seem paranoid, I couldn't have lived with that. So I spoke up. Thank God I did." Aaron's article, "The Man Who Felt What Instruments Couldn't: How Autism Saved Flight 8091, became one of the most widely read stories of the year. It detailed Robert's unique sensory abilities, his whispered calculations throughout the flight, Captain Torres's decision to believe him despite no instrumental evidence, and the crack that would have killed everyone if it hadn't been detected. Robert Hendricks represents something aviation hadn't fully appreciated. Aaron wrote, "Neurodivergent individuals often have sensory capabilities that exceed typical human range. Robert's autism, which society often treats as a disability, gave him the ability to sense structural failure that billion-dollar monitoring systems missed. He saved 192 lives by trusting perception that others had told him to ignore." That's not just a rescue story. That's a reminder that different doesn't mean less capable. Sometimes it means more capable in ways we haven't learned to value. The aviation industry had to grapple with uncomfortable questions. If a passenger could sense structural failure that instruments missed, what did that say about reliance on technology? How many other times had aircraft flown with undetected damage? The FAA mandated immediate inspection of all similar aircraft for the specific failure mode found on Flight 8091. They discovered 3 more aircraft with cracks in the same component, all caught before failure, all potentially catastrophic if they'd continued flying undetected. Robert's perception had not only saved Flight 8091 but had identified a systemic problem affecting the fleet. Boeing revised their structural monitoring systems, adding sensors in areas previously uncovered, developing new algorithms to detect unusual vibration patterns. But they also did something unprecedented. They consulted with Robert and other neurodivergent engineers about how sensory perception could supplement instrumental monitoring. "We've been designing systems for neurotypical perception," a Boeing engineer admitted. "Robert showed us we're missing data that some people can perceive naturally. We need to learn from that." 6 months after Flight 8091, Captain Michael Torres testified before an NTSB hearing about his decision to divert based on a passenger's perception. Some questioned whether his decision had been reckless, abandoning instrumental data for subjective human feeling. But Michael stood firm. Dr. Hendricks wasn't just any passenger. He was an expert in the exact type of failure he suspected. He provided technical analysis, not just vague concern. I evaluated his credibility, his expertise, and his certainty against my instruments showing normal. I made a judgment call that his specialized perception might detect something instruments missed. I was right to trust him, and I'd make the same decision again. The NTSB ultimately commended Michael's decision-making, noting that Captain Torres demonstrated exceptional judgment in evaluating a non-standard information source. While pilots must primarily rely on instruments, Captain Torres correctly assessed that Dr. Hendricks' expertise and specific technical knowledge warranted serious consideration. His decision to divert prevented catastrophic structural failure and loss of all aboard. This case demonstrates that pilot judgment must remain paramount even in an age of advanced instrumentation. Robert Hendricks became an unlikely celebrity in aviation safety circles. He was invited to speak at aerospace conferences about sensory perception and structural analysis. Airlines consulted him about vibration analysis. Boeing hired him as a consultant to help develop next-generation structural monitoring systems. But Robert remained humble. "I don't want to be famous for having autism that lets me feel aircraft structures," he told Aaron in a follow-up interview. "I want people to understand that neurodivergent individuals have capabilities that shouldn't be dismissed. My difference saved lives because one captain was willing to listen. How many other neurodivergent people have valuable perceptions that get ignored because they're different? We need to start listening to different perspectives instead of dismissing them." Rebecca Santos, the flight attendant who'd first taken Robert seriously and brought him to the captain, received commendations for her role. "She didn't dismiss me as a paranoid passenger," Robert emphasized in interviews. "She listened, recognized I had legitimate expertise, and escalated my concern to someone who could act on it." Rebecca was as crucial to saving Flight 89-1 as Captain Torres. She was the bridge between my perception and the captain's decision-making. The 192 passengers of Flight 89-1 formed an association, staying connected through the shared trauma and miracle of their survival. They met annually on the anniversary of the diversion, celebrating life and honoring Robert and Captain Torres. At the 5-year reunion, passengers shared what they'd done with the years Robert had given them. Children born, careers built, dreams achieved. "I had my first grandchild 2 years after Flight 89-1, one passenger told Robert. "She wouldn't exist if you hadn't spoken up. Thank you for my granddaughter's life." Robert was moved by these stories but also pained by them. "I almost didn't say anything," he confessed to the group. "I spent 2 hours talking myself out of speaking up because I'd been wrong before, because I didn't want to seem paranoid, because authority figures had told me to trust instruments over my perception. If I'd stayed silent just a little longer, you'd all be dead. That haunts me. Not that I saved you, but how close I came to not saving you because I'd been trained to doubt myself." His words sparked a broader conversation about how society treats neurodivergent individuals. How often are their different perceptions dismissed as wrong rather than simply different? How much valuable information do we lose by insisting everyone perceive the world the normal way? Robert's case became a touchstone in neurodiversity advocacy. Robert Hendricks proves that different perception can be life-saving perception, advocacy groups emphasized. Society needs to stop trying to make neurodivergent people perceive normally and start learning from their different perceptions. Difference is data. Different perception is valuable information. Robert saw what instruments missed. How many other Roberts are out there with valuable perceptions we're ignoring? 10 years after Flight 8091, the structural monitoring systems Robert had helped Boeing develop were standard in new aircraft. These systems incorporated understanding of how human perception, especially enhanced sensory perception some neurodivergent individuals possess, could supplement instrumental data. Pilots were trained that unusual passenger reports, especially from passengers with relevant expertise, should be evaluated seriously even when instruments showed normal readings. Robert's case was taught in every aviation program as an example of how human perception and instrumental data should work together rather than in opposition. Robert continued flying regularly, now without fear, because he trusted that if he felt something wrong, people would listen. And on 2 occasions in the decade after Flight 8091, Robert did feel problems, once a developing hydraulic issue, once an electrical fault. Both times he reported his concerns, both times maintenance found exactly what he'd described, both times small problems were caught before becoming serious. Robert's perception had become a supplemental safety system, valued rather than dismissed. Captain Michael Torres retired from flying at age 65, his final years marked by the knowledge that he'd made the right call on Flight 8091. "I trusted an expert with unusual perceptions over my instruments," Michael would say in retrospective interviews. "That decision saved everyone. The lesson isn't to ignore instruments. They're crucial. The lesson is that instruments aren't infallible, and human expertise, even unusual human expertise, has value. We need both. We need instruments and human perception working together, not competing. At Michael's retirement ceremony, Robert attended to personally thank the captain one final time. "You didn't just save my life that day," Robert told Michael. "You validated my perception. You showed me that my difference has value. You trusted me when you had every reason to doubt. That changed my life. I'd spent 40 years being told my sensory perceptions were unreliable. You proved they weren't. You gave me confidence to trust myself. Thank you for believing me." Michael embraced Robert. "You made it easy to believe you. Your expertise was obvious. Your analysis was technical and specific. Your certainty was convincing. I didn't just trust your difference. I trusted your knowledge and your conviction. That's what made the difference. You didn't just say something feels wrong. You explained exactly what was wrong and why. That's what I could act on." Rebecca Santos, now a senior flight attendant and trainer, used Flight 8091 as a teaching example for new crew members. When a passenger expresses a serious concern, evaluate their credibility. Dr. Hendricks wasn't just worried, he was an aerospace engineer describing specific technical problems. That combination of expertise and concern demanded serious consideration. Learn to distinguish between general passenger anxiety and specific expert concern. One requires reassurance. The other requires escalation. I escalated Dr. Hendricks's concern to the captain because his expertise and specificity indicated it was credible. That saved everyone. Learn to recognize credibility and act on it. 15 years after Flight 8091, the Boeing 757 that had nearly failed was still in a museum, the cracked fitting preserved and displayed alongside the story of how it was discovered. Visitors to the museum could see the crack that would have killed everyone, could read Robert's story, could understand how one man's whispered calculations and unique sensory perception had prevented catastrophe. School groups toured the exhibit learning about neurodiversity and how different perceptions have value. Engineering students studied the failure mode. Aviation professionals reflected on the importance of combining instrumental and human observation. Robert, now in his late 60s and semi-retired, occasionally gave tours of the exhibit, explaining to visitors what he'd felt, how he'd calculated the danger, why he'd overcome his fear of speaking up. "The hardest part wasn't sensing the crack," Robert would tell visitors. "It was trusting myself enough to report it. Society had taught me to doubt my different perceptions. But on Flight 8091, I chose to trust myself despite that conditioning. That choice saved 192 lives. I tell you this not to celebrate myself, but to encourage everyone, especially neurodivergent people, to trust their perceptions. Your difference might be exactly what's needed in a critical moment. Don't let others convince you your different perception is wrong. It might be different and right. Trust yourself." Aaron's final article about Flight 8091, published on the 15th anniversary, reflected on legacy and impact. 15 years ago, a man who whispered calculations throughout a flight saved everyone aboard by trusting perception that instruments missed. Robert Hendricks showed aviation that neurodivergent sensory perception has value, that expertise comes in unexpected forms, that listening to difference can save lives. His legacy isn't just the lives saved that day, but the systems changed, the attitude shifted, the understanding deepened about how neurodiversity enriches rather than diminishes capability. Robert whispered his way through terror to truth, through self-doubt to conviction, through dismissal to validation. He saved 192 people by refusing to stay silent. That's heroism, not fearlessness, but speaking despite fear. Not certainty, but trusting yourself despite doubt. Not conformity, but valuing your difference enough to share it. Robert Hendricks, the man who felt what instruments couldn't, who whispered himself to understanding, who saved everyone by trusting his unique perception. That's not just an aviation story. That's a human story about the power of embracing difference, trusting expertise, and listening when someone speaks truth in an unusual way. We're all safer because Robert trusted himself. We're all richer because Captain Torres trusted Robert. We're all better because Flight 8091 taught us that different perception is valuable perception, that whispered calculations can be louder than instruments, that the most important thing we can do is listen, really listen to those whose perception differs from our own. That's the lesson. That's the gift. That's why Robert's whispered warning will echo through aviation history forever, a reminder that sometimes the quietest voice carries the most critical truth, and our job is to hear it. The passengers of Flight 8091, now scattered across the world, still thought about that day. Most had moments where they wondered what would have happened if Robert hadn't spoken up, if Captain Torres hadn't listened, if Rebecca hadn't taken him seriously. They'd have been flying over the Midwest when the fitting failed. The aircraft would have broken apart in seconds. Nobody would have survived. Instead, they'd gotten 15 more years. Births, weddings, graduations, grandchildren, careers, dreams fulfilled. All because a man who whispered to himself on airplanes had trusted his whispers enough to share them, and because others had trusted him enough to act. That was the miracle, not avoiding death, but choosing to trust difference, expertise, and perception that didn't fit standard patterns. That trust had saved everyone. And that trust continued saving people as the lessons of Flight 8091 spread through aviation and beyond, teaching the world to listen to whispered truths, to value different perceptions, to trust that sometimes the person who seems unusual is the person with the exact unusual capability needed to save lives. That was Robert Hendricks. That was Flight 8091. That was the whisper that saved 192 people and changed how the world thinks about difference, perception, and the extraordinary value of listening to those whose perceptions don't fit the standard mold. Because sometimes, the most important safety system isn't an instrument at all. Sometimes it's a human being whose difference makes them uniquely capable of sensing what others miss. Sometimes it's a whispered calculation that's more accurate than a computer. Sometimes it's trusting someone whose perception defies conventional understanding. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. That's why Flight 8091 matters, and always will.